The night is still. A faint wind moves through the corridors of time, brushing softly against the forgotten faces of kings and queens whose names have long since slipped into silence. Candles flicker over old portraits, their colors faded, their gazes hollow with memory. Somewhere in that vast darkness between history and myth, voices murmur, not in the loud tones of conquest, but in the gentle sighs of lives once grand, now ghost-like. This is where our story begins, not among the famous monarchs of textbooks, but with those whose scandals and secrets were swallowed by the centuries. Royalty has always shimmered like a mirage, dazzling from afar, yet fragile up close. Crowns are made of gold, yes, but they rest on mortal heads that tremble and dream and break. Beneath the jewels lies skin, beneath the robes lies fear. These rulers, once worshipped, were also human, capable of tenderness and cruelty, brilliance and folly. And as the world changed around them, they were either adored to death or forgotten in silence. Tonight, we wander into that silence, letting it whisper back to us what history left behind. There is something strangely comforting about forgotten royalty. They remind us that even those who seemed untouchable were touched by loneliness. Their lives were painted in bright colors of triumph, but the shadows were always deeper: jealousy, betrayal, forbidden love, madness, and exile. Their stories are lullabies of power and consequence, where the music of the court slowly fades into the hum of night. We remember them not for the wars they fought, but for the secrets they carried into their final sleep. Imagine the echoing halls of old palaces, footsteps on marble, the rustle of silk gowns, the hush of servants who knew too much. In these spaces, time does not move forward, it lingers. Dust gathers where once there was glory. Every faded tapestry hides a scandal. Every empty throne remembers the weight of guilt and grandeur. As we move through these stories, we are not historians tonight. We are quiet visitors, listening to the forgotten heartbeats of kings and queens who once believed themselves eternal. The scandal of monarchy is not always what is written in official chronicles. Often, it is what remains unspoken, a love that could not be named, a betrayal that could not be proven, a fear that could not be confessed. These are the ghosts that haunt royal history. They slip through the gaps in the record, appearing only when someone, centuries later, decides to listen differently. That is what we are doing here, listening not for the trumpet blasts of coronations, but for the softer, trembling notes of human truth. It is easy to think of kings and queens as symbols, the embodiment of nations, of divine right, of perfection. Yet when the candles burn low and the courtiers leave, a ruler is simply a soul in a gilded cage. Power isolates. Luxury suffocates. Every monarch, no matter how mighty, eventually confronts the same question that all humans do. What remains when the applause ends? For some, it was madness. For others, love. For a few, the answer was death in exile or disgrace. These are the stories that history tried to hide beneath marble and myth. Tonight, we lift those veils gently. We will visit Bavaria's dreamer king, whose castles were built for fantasies rather than nations. We will meet queens who defied their crowns, kings who were prisoners of their own minds, rulers erased by their enemies or condemned by their own desires. Their scandals will not roar. They will whisper softly through the rhythm of memory. Each story will glow faintly, like embers in the dark, until together they form a quiet constellation of royal tragedy and wonder. There's a special kind of peace in exploring the ruins of power. Unlike the loud triumphs of history, these stories hum with melancholy, the kind that makes you breathe slower, listen deeper. You can almost hear the soft rustle of a gown disappearing through a hidden corridor, the sigh of a crown laid down in surrender. These moments do not demand judgment. They ask only for understanding. To see these forgotten rulers not as symbols of corruption or glory, but as people, fragile, flawed, and fleeting, is to see ourselves reflected in them. In the distance, the world of the living continues. Bright screens, busy streets, endless noise. But here, in this gentle shadow of the past, time dissolves. You can close your eyes and let the centuries fall away. Imagine candlelight flickering across painted ceilings, the faint scent of incense, the distant sound of a harp. Somewhere, a king writes a letter he will never send. A queen hides a tear behind her jeweled fan. Their secrets are safe, except for this moment, when we choose to remember. And so, this journey begins not with spectacle, but with stillness. The throne rooms we enter are empty now, yet filled with echoes. Every scandal we uncover will be more than gossip. It will be a mirror, showing how power distorts and desire reveals. Each royal figure will rise slowly from the dust, not to reclaim their crowns, but to remind us that the heart of history beats softly, even in silence. Let the world outside fade for a while. Let the rhythm of forgotten footsteps carry you across time. As the candles burn low and the music of memory begins, we step together into the half-light, where kings and queens, once adored, now wait to be remembered. Welcome to the realm of whispered thrones, where scandal sleeps beside sorrow, and the forgotten are finally allowed to dream again. The moonlight rests softly over Bavaria, silvering the waters of Lake Starnberg and tracing the outline of castles that look as if they were built for dreams, not for men. Somewhere behind those marble towers and shimmering reflections, a solitary figure once walked. King Ludwig II of Bavaria, known to history as the Swan King. His story, like the castles he left behind, is both breathtaking and haunted. Tonight, we wander quietly into his world, where beauty was an obsession, loneliness was a companion, and scandal arrived like a shadow at twilight. Ludwig was born into a realm of mountains and mist, a land poised between fairy tale and duty. From his earliest years, he preferred fantasy to governance. He loved the operas of Wagner, the chivalric legends of Lohengrin, and the ethereal promise of art over the coarse business of politics. When he became king at just 18, Bavaria expected a ruler. What it received was a dreamer wrapped in velvet silence. To his people, he was distant and strange. To himself, he was a misunderstood artist forced to wear a crown. He built castles that defied reality. Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee, not fortresses of power, but temples to imagination. Each one more extravagant, more impossible, more beautiful than the last. By candlelight, he wandered through mirrored halls alone, surrounded by painted swans, frescoes of knights, and ceilings that shimmered like northern skies. He dined at a table that rose through the floor by mechanical design, so he would never have to see his servant. The world he built was a stage, and he was both actor and audience. But dreams are expensive, and kingdoms are not built on poetry. The Bavarian treasury strained under the weight of his creations. Ministers whispered of madness, and foreign ambassadors watched with quiet fascination. They called him eccentric, unfit, and obsessed. Yet what was madness, really, in a man who saw beauty as salvation? Ludwig longed for purity in an age that prized politics and profit. His castles, far from being symbols of waste, were his rebellion, his attempt to carve out eternity in an impermanent world. Behind the grandeur, however, was a loneliness so deep it bordered on despair. Ludwig withdrew more and more from public life, retreating into night. He slept during the day, living by moonlight, as though sunlight itself were too harsh for his fragile sensibilities. The court saw less and less of him. He spoke often of his love for music, his devotion to Wagner, and his wish to live among the beautiful and the eternal. Yet behind that poetic longing, rumors began to stir, of forbidden loves, of secret letters, of passions that could not be named in the strict society of the 19th century. His friendship with the composer Richard Wagner burned bright and complex. Wagner saw in Ludwig a patron and muse. Ludwig saw in Wagner a god of art and spirit. Their relationship scandalized courtiers, who could not understand the depth of their emotional connection. When Ludwig's ministers forced Wagner to flee Bavaria, the young king was heartbroken. His letters, full of tenderness and yearning, survived as whispers of a love that was never allowed to speak its name. Some say that Ludwig's greatest tragedy was not madness, but the simple ache of being born in a world too small for his heart. The years drifted by like mist across his lakes. Bavaria modernized, but Ludwig retreated further into solitude. He filled his nights with candlelit boat rides across the water, dressed in capes of dark velvet, gazing at the reflection of the moon. His servants told stories of his melancholy, how he spoke to himself, how he wandered his halls in silence, how he wept at the sound of distant music. He was a man at war with the ordinary world, longing for a reality that no longer existed. Then came the scandal that would end it all. In 1886, the government of Bavaria declared him insane. A commission of doctors, who had never examined him in person, signed a document that stripped him of his throne. He was placed under arrest in his own palace, guarded not by soldiers of loyalty, but by keepers of caution. His cousin, Prince Luitpold, was made regent. The dreamer king, who had once filled mountains with marble and light, was now a prisoner of reason. 2 days later, he was found dead. The evening was still, the air heavy with rain. He had been walking along Lake Starnberg with Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, the physician who had signed his insanity declaration. Hours later, both were discovered floating face down in shallow water. The king's watch had stopped at 6:54 p.m. The doctor's hat was found nearby, crushed. Officially, it was declared a drowning, a tragic accident. But even in the calm of official words, something was wrong. There were no signs of struggle. Ludwig was an excellent swimmer. Some witnesses claimed to have heard gunshots that evening, though none were ever proven. The truth was quietly buried, along with the king himself. To this day, the death of Ludwig II remains a riddle wrapped in mist. Was it suicide, the final act of a man undone by loneliness and betrayal, or murder, a convenient ending for those who wanted his costly dream silenced? The lake keeps its secrets, dark and unbroken, reflecting only the stars. Visitors still come to its edge, where a simple cross stands in the water. They speak softly, as if afraid to wake him. And yet, in a way, Ludwig never truly died. His castles remain, Neuschwanstein rising like a fantasy against the Bavarian Alps, now one of the most visited places on Earth. Millions of travelers stand before its gates each year, unaware that they are walking through the fragments of a single man's imagination. In the soft light of dawn, when the tourists are gone, you can still feel what Ludwig felt, the quiet ache of beauty too fragile for the world. Perhaps that is the real scandal, not his eccentricity, nor his rumored madness, but the way he dared to live entirely for beauty in a world that demanded practicality. He was a poet wearing a crown, a king who built dreams instead of empires. His story reminds us that sometimes the most extravagant lives are lived not for power, but for escape, from judgment, from loneliness, from the heavy noise of reality. So the Swan King drifts forever through the twilight of memory, neither saint nor sinner, neither mad nor sane, only human, endlessly searching for the line between wonder and ruin. And as the night settles over Bavaria once more, his castles gleam like constellations, not monuments of failure, but quiet proof that even in tragedy, beauty endures. The air grows colder as we leave the soft lakes of Bavaria behind and drift northward, over frozen forests and pale skies, to the quiet heart of 17th century Sweden. The world here is one of restraint and discipline, snowbound courtyards, candlelit halls, and silence that carries the weight of royal duty. Yet within that silence lived a woman who refused to be defined by it. Queen Christina of Sweden, the daughter of a warrior king, a monarch who turned her crown into a riddle, and whose scandal was not born of lust or greed, but of thought, a rebellion of the mind, of identity, and of spirit. She came into the world amid thunder. Her father, King Gustavus Adolphus, died in battle when she was only 6 years old. The crown was placed upon her head before she could even read the oaths it demanded. Sweden, a country hardened by war and piety, saw in her the promise of continuation, a child destined to uphold the empire her father had built. But Christina was never content to be merely a symbol of legacy. Even as a girl, she showed signs of independence that unsettled her tutors. She preferred study to ceremony, philosophy to obedience. The stories say she walked with quick steps, spoke in low, deliberate tones, and often dressed in masculine attire. She was fond of fencing, horseback riding, and theological debates. Her court was filled with scholars, artists, and travelers from all corners of Europe. While her peers were expected to embody the delicate grace of queenship, Christina sought intellect, not admiration. It was said she could discuss Aristotle as easily as she could dismiss a general. The courtiers whispered about her restlessness, her refusal to marry, her disregard for fashion, her strange delight in ideas over appearances. At 20, she was crowned Queen of Sweden. The throne room glittered, the nobles bowed, and the hymns rose like frost in the air. Yet even in that moment of triumph, Christina seemed detached, almost distant. To her, power was not a prize, but a burden, a cage lined with gold. The court expected her to produce heirs, to secure alliances, to rule as her father had ruled. But Christina longed for something that could not be found in diplomacy or dynasty. She wanted truth. She wanted freedom, not of territory, but of thought. She filled her court with philosophers and artists, turning Stockholm into a northern Athens. She invited René Descartes himself to Sweden, though the cold in her schedule would claim his life within months. She devoured books on science, history, and religion, building one of Europe's most remarkable private libraries. Her ministers despaired. She spent too much time on conversation, too little on governance. The people began to murmur. The clergy grew uneasy. A queen so fascinated by ideas was, to them, a queen distracted from God. But Christina's mind moved faster than the world around her. She questioned everything: power, gender, and faith itself. In her letters, she wrote that she did not wish to be chained by the common fate of women. Her refusal to marry became the first of many scandals. Suitors from across Europe sought her hand, yet she declined them all with quiet, almost mischievous grace. Her cousin Charles, who was next in line, waited patiently, perhaps knowing that the queen's restlessness would one day deliver him the crown. Behind her intelligence was an unyielding spiritual hunger. The rigid Protestant faith of her ancestors began to feel hollow. She sought mystery and depth, and found herself drawn to Catholicism, a dangerous attraction in Protestant Sweden. Her secret correspondence with Jesuit thinkers, her fascination with ritual and symbolism, began to alarm her council. Rumors grew that she was planning to abdicate. Few believed it. No monarch of her stature had ever stepped away from the throne by choice. But Christina was not most monarchs. In 1654, she summoned the nobility to the great hall of Uppsala Castle. The air was heavy with disbelief. Before them stood the queen, radiant and calm, dressed in black. She announced her abdication in simple, unwavering words. She spoke of exhaustion, of her desire for peace, for study, for life beyond ceremony. As she placed the crown into the hands of her cousin Charles, a silence fell, the kind that belongs not to history, but to myth. She bowed once, turned, and walked away, leaving behind her titles, her court, and her country. When she crossed the border into Denmark disguised as a man, riding in the night, her transformation was complete. She had traded a crown for anonymity. From that moment on, she became a traveler, a wanderer between worlds. In Innsbruck, she revealed her conversion to Catholicism, causing shockwaves across Europe. Protestant rulers denounced her. The Vatican received her with cautious admiration. Her move was both scandal and revelation. A royal soul escaping the cold certainties of duty for the warmth of faith and art. Rome became her true home, the city where she would spend her later years surrounded by painters, poets, and philosophers. Her palace on the Janiculum Hill glittered with candlelight and conversation. Cardinals visited her salons, and ambassadors sought her company, though few could truly understand her. She sponsored operas, patronized artists, and became a figure of fascination, a queen without a throne, a woman without a defined role, living freely in an age that did not understand such freedom. But scandal followed her still. Her friendship with Cardinal Azzolino, a man known for his intellect and rumored affection for her, stirred endless gossip. Some claimed they shared a secret love. Others believed theirs was a meeting of minds alone. Whatever the truth, Christina's letters to him are tender and filled with longing, not of passion, but of companionship. They reveal a woman who, despite her independence, yearned to be understood completely, if only by one soul. She never married, never returned to Sweden, and never apologized for any of it. When she died in 1689, she requested to be buried in Rome, an honor rarely granted to a non-Italian monarch. Even in death, she defied expectation. The city laid her to rest in St. Peter's Basilica, among popes and saints, her name carved into the marble not as queen, but as Christina, simply Christina. Her life remains a paradox of light and shadow. To her contemporaries, she was scandalous, a woman who turned her back on power, gender norms, and the faith of her ancestors. To later generations, she became a symbol of individuality, of courage against conformity. In her story, the contrast is eternal. The cold of duty against the warmth of curiosity, the silence of a crown against the music of thought. And as the snow falls over Stockholm even now, one can almost imagine her voice echoing softly through the winter air, the voice of a queen who chose not to rule, but to live. Her scandal was not betrayal or excess, but the quiet audacity to be herself in a world that demanded she be something else. She remains in the long whisper of history, a reminder that some thrones are meant not to be sat upon, but to be left behind, gleaming quietly in the dark. The air grows warmer as the story drifts south toward the glittering heart of 18th century France, the Palace of Versailles. Its golden gates, its endless mirrors, its gardens trimmed into perfection, all shimmer beneath a sun that never seems to set. But beneath the silks and perfume, beneath the laughter and the orchestra's hum, lies a quiet unease. The corridors smell of roses and resentment. The chandeliers gleam with both beauty and burden. In the center of it all stands a young queen, her face radiant and distant, Marie Antoinette. To some, she was the very image of decadence. To others, she was a scapegoat for a nation's hunger. Tonight, her story unfolds not in the roar of revolution, but in the hush of her private moments, a life painted in gold, then undone by whispers. She was barely 14 when she arrived in France, a child sent to marry a future king she had never met. The journey from Vienna to Versailles was long, and when she crossed the border, she was stripped of her Austrian clothes, her jewels, even her name. She became, in that instant, the property of France, a living symbol of an alliance, a vessel for diplomacy. The courtiers studied her every movement. Her laughter, her accent, her posture, everything was weighed and judged. Yet she smiled through it, graceful and bewildered, as if believing that charm alone could make her beloved. Her husband, Louis, shy and awkward, offered companionship without passion. The marriage, unconsummated for years, became a subject of scandal across Europe. Pamphlets mocked her, gossips feasted on her supposed coldness, and the court, ever hungry for intrigue, turned her into a target of ridicule. In response, she sought solace not in politics, but in pleasure. She filled her days with theater, fashion, and elaborate entertainments. The Queen of France became a performer in her own kingdom, dressing in powdered wigs and shimmering gowns that caught the light like fire. Versailles, however, was a palace built on illusion. Every smile hid competition, every compliment masked envy. The Queen's attempts at joy, her masquerades, her private plays, her gardens at Petit Trianon, were seen by many as proof of arrogance. In truth, they were escapes. The small, secluded estate of Petit Trianon was a refuge, a place where she could live simply, surrounded by flowers and friends, free from the endless eyes of the court. There she wore muslin gowns and straw hats, played shepherdess, and dreamed of a quieter life. But simplicity, too, became scandal. The people, starving and restless, heard rumors of a queen playing at poverty, of milkmaids made of silk and diamonds. The myth grew, larger than the woman herself. She was not heartless, as history often paints her. She donated to charities, adopted poor children, and visited hospitals. Yet compassion does little to erase perception. The people wanted bread. She was seen surrounded by cakes. The famous line, "Let them eat cake," though never truly hers, became her legacy, a cruel phrase she never uttered but could never escape. In the court of public opinion, truth was irrelevant. Appearance was everything. And Marie Antoinette's appearance, dazzling and detached, was her undoing. As the years passed, her beauty began to fade beneath the strain of politics and motherhood. For children came, though only 2 would live to adulthood. Her husband ascended the throne as Louis XVI, and she became queen at 20. France was changing. The Enlightenment whispered of liberty, philosophers questioned divine right, and the streets began to murmur. The monarchy, trapped in ceremony and denial, could not hear the thunder building beyond the gates. In the candlelit halls, as the orchestra played waltzes, the cracks beneath the marble widened. Then came the affair of the diamond necklace, a scandal she neither caused nor benefited from, yet which destroyed what little goodwill remained toward her. A cunning countess forged letters in her name, convincing a cardinal that the queen desired an extravagant necklace worth a fortune. When the deception was exposed, the queen's innocence meant nothing. The public wanted someone to blame, and Marie Antoinette, already painted as frivolous and vain, fit the part perfectly. Pamphlets once again filled Paris. Lewd drawings, cruel satires, endless lies. The queen who had once been adored was now despised. At Versailles, she began to feel the isolation closing in. Friends turned distant. Courtiers grew cautious. Only her children and a few loyal companions remained near. She walked the gardens at dusk, her once sparkling eyes now heavy with worry. She had been raised to rule, yet found herself powerless against rumor and fate. Every laugh she gave was scrutinized. Every tear was seen as strategy. The crown had become a weight she could no longer carry with grace. When the revolution finally reached Versailles, it came not with ceremony, but with shouts and torches. The mob stormed the palace on an October morning in 1789. They broke through gates, trampled the marble floors, and demanded her presence. Barely dressed, she appeared on the balcony to face them. Thousands of angry faces illuminated by firelight. She stood still, trembling but proud. Some shouted insults, others fell silent, moved by her composure. She bowed once, slowly, as if acknowledging both her guilt and her innocence. That moment, quiet, fearless, and tragic, became the true image of Marie Antoinette. The years that followed were a long descent. Imprisonment, separation from her children, the execution of her husband. Each loss carved her into someone unrecognizable. Her hair turned white almost overnight. In the small, damp cell of the conciergerie, she wrote letters, tender, careful, filled with faith. To her sister, to her surviving children, to her captors even, she offered forgiveness. The woman once accused of arrogance now faced death with grace that no court could stage. On the morning of October 16, 1793, she was led to the guillotine. Her hands bound, her white dress plain, she walked through the streets of Paris beneath a gray sky. The crowd jeered, but she did not flinch. When she stepped onto the platform, she accidentally trod on her executioner's foot and whispered, "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean to." Those words, soft and sincere, were her last. The blade fell, and the square fell silent. But death did not erase her. The legend of Marie Antoinette grew larger with each passing decade, painted, rewritten, misunderstood. Some saw her as the face of vanity. others as a victim of circumstance. The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. She was not an angel, nor a monster, but a woman born into a role too immense for any human to bear. Her scandals, when seen through time's gentle lens, become less about arrogance and more about fragility. The fragility of power, of perception, of being seen but never known. Even now, when the halls of Versailles grow quiet after the tourists have gone, her spirit seems to linger in the mirrors, gazing back at itself. The reflection shimmers. A girl who wanted to be loved, a queen who was misunderstood, a woman who learned too late that beauty cannot shield against history. The palace, once her stage, has become her mausoleum. And as the night settles over its gilded walls, her story whispers through the marble. Not a tale of luxury, but a lullaby of loss, reminding us that behind every crown is a heart that bleeds in silence. The air changes once more, from the perfumed gardens of Versailles to the burning sands of ancient Egypt, where the sun itself ruled as king. Here, amid the whispers of the desert and the shadows of temples long buried in dust, lies the story of a monarch whose scandal was not of love or luxury, but of faith. Pharaoh Akhenaten, the heretic king, the dreamer of Aten, a ruler who dared to challenge centuries of tradition and reshape the divine order of his world. His was a scandal written not in the language of court gossip, but in the language of gods and eternity. Before Akhenaten, Egypt was a land of countless deities, a civilization bound by ritual, by the steady rhythm of offerings and prayers to a pantheon of gods. For over 1,000 years, order had reigned through divine repetition. But then came a pharaoh unlike any before him, one whose eyes seemed to look beyond the world around him, fixed on a light unseen by others. Born Amenhotep IV, he inherited the throne of Egypt's 18th dynasty and was expected to continue the lineage of warrior kings and sun priests. Instead, he turned the empire's gaze toward a single radiant symbol, Aten, the sun disk. At first, his reforms seemed poetic, a celebration of sunlight, of warmth, of creation. He spoke of Aten not as a god among gods, but as the one source of all life, the giver of breath to every creature. His hymns described the sun's rays reaching across the world, touching the poor and the mighty alike. But what began as devotion soon became revolution. Akhenaten closed the temples of other gods, redirected their wealth to Aten's worship, and ordered the erasure of Egypt's beloved deities, including Ammonius, the god his own father had served. The priests, powerful and ancient, watched with quiet horror as their world was dismantled. Then came the most visible scandal of all, the creation of a new capital city, far from Thebes, carved out of desert and light. He named it Akhetaten, the horizon of Aten. It was a city built not for power, but for purity, with open-air temples that let the sunlight flood through. Walls were painted not with battles and conquests, but with scenes of domestic tenderness, the royal family holding hands, the pharaoh kissing his daughters beneath the rays of the god. The tone of Egyptian art changed entirely, softened by intimacy. Gone were the rigid forms of past pharaohs. Akhenaten's statues showed him with elongated limbs, wide hips, and a strange, almost otherworldly face. Some thought this divine exaggeration. Others whispered it was deformity. In truth, it was both, an attempt to merge the human and the divine into one figure. Beside him stood Nefertiti, his queen, his mirror, his equal. Together, they appeared as two halves of a single vision, the male and female embodiment of Aten's light. Their partnership scandalized the court not because of sin, but because of symmetry. Egypt had never seen a king and queen portrayed as spiritual equals. In every carving, every painting, they are shown together, bathed in the sun's rays that end in tiny hands offering them life. Theirs was a love that transcended convention, both political and sacred. And yet, behind the beauty, the empire was unraveling. The priests plotted in silence. The common people, who had prayed to their household gods for generations, were confused and resentful. The temples, once filled with the sound of chants and drums, now stood empty. Farmers feared the old god's wrath. Soldiers murmured that their pharaoh had abandoned the gods of war for the god of peace. Even the royal officials began to turn against him. Still, Akhenaten remained distant from it all, absorbed in his devotion. To him, art and worship were the same. He saw himself not as a ruler of men, but as a bridge between humanity and the sun. Historians often describe him as an idealist, a mystic lost in his own faith. Yet his reign, for all its beauty, carried the shadow of obsession. As famine struck and unrest grew, the pharaoh retreated further into his radiant city, isolating himself and his court from the suffering beyond its gates. His letters to foreign allies went unanswered. The once great empire began to fracture at its edges. But within Akhenaten, time seemed to stop. The royal family lived in a perpetual dawn, their lives painted in gold and serenity, untouched by the world collapsing around them. Then, as suddenly as his revolution had begun, it ended. Akhenaten disappeared from the record, perhaps dead, perhaps dethroned. His successors, eager to restore order, destroyed his city, defaced his statues, and erased his name from the king lists. They called him the heretic pharaoh, the one who betrayed the gods. His images were smashed, his hymns forgotten, his body possibly moved or desecrated. His own son, the boy king Tutankhaten, was renamed Tutankhamun, the servant of Ammonius, signaling Egypt's return to its many gods. What Akhenaten had built from light was swallowed by darkness. For centuries, his name was lost. The sands covered his city, the sun bleached his monuments, and only silence remained. Yet, even buried, the traces of his revolution survived. Fragments of poetry, glimpses of art unlike anything else in Egypt's vast history. When archaeologists unearthed Akhenaten thousands of years later, they found not ruins of tyranny, but of longing. Walls painted with affection, with tenderness between parents and children, scenes that felt startlingly human. It was as if, amid his divine ambitions, Akhenaten had tried to reveal something deeply mortal, that even kings, even gods crave love. Perhaps that was his greatest scandal of all. In a civilization built on eternity, he embraced impermanence. In a religion of order, he sought intimacy. He turned the gaze of Egypt away from the heavens filled with gods and toward the warmth of a single sun, the same sun that touches every soul, every creature. He was both prophet and heretic, both artist and ruler, both dreamer and destroyer. As the desert night descends, the ruins of Amarna lie quiet under the stars. The wind moves through the hollow doorways, carrying faint echoes of his hymns. You rise in perfection on the horizon of the sky, living Aten, creator of life. The world he built is gone, yet the questions he asked still linger, about power, faith, and a longing for unity in a fractured world. Akhenaten's story glows softly in the darkness of history, the tale of a king who tried to capture the light itself and was consumed by it. His legacy reminds us that even in the most ancient times, humanity has always struggled between devotion and desire, truth and illusion, eternity and the fragile, fleeting warmth of the sun. And as dawn returns to the desert, his name, once erased, rises again, carried on the first breath of morning, quiet and eternal. The scene shifts eastward now, across oceans of time and wind, to the heart of ancient China. The Tang dynasty glimmers like a memory of silk and gold, an empire at its height, rich with poetry, invention, and intrigue. It is a world of poets and courtesans, monks and warriors, palaces veiled in incense and fear. In this realm of refinement and restraint, a single woman rose higher than any before her or after. Her name was Wu Zetian, the only woman in China's long history to rule as emperor in her own right. Her life was both a triumph and a scandal, a story woven from ambition, brilliance, betrayal, and survival. In the beginning, She was nothing more than a concubine in the court of Emperor Taizong. A young girl of intelligence and quiet poise, she entered the palace as one of many, an ornament among hundreds, destined to fade into anonymity. Yet what was not ordinary. She observed everything: the gossip of eunuchs, the shifting glances of ministers, the hidden machinery of power that moved behind the gilded screens. She learned that in this court, beauty could open doors, but intellect could keep them open. And she possessed both. When Emperor Taizong died, the law required that all his concubines withdraw into Buddhist temples for the rest of their lives, a living death of silence and prayer. Wu was sent away, shaven-headed, her youth seemingly buried. But fate, or perhaps her own will, was not finished with her. The new emperor, Gaozong, Taizong's son, visited the temple one day and saw her again. Their eyes met, and history shifted. Soon, she returned to the palace, not as a forgotten concubine, but as the emperor's favored companion. It was scandalous beyond measure. She had been his father's woman. Now she would become his queen. The court whispered, horrified, but the emperor would not be swayed. Wu Zetian's rise was as swift as it was ruthless. She learned that survival in the palace required more than charm. It required precision. She outmaneuvered rivals with calm brilliance, using patience as her blade. Her most dangerous enemy was the empress herself, Wang, who once held Gaozong's affection. Legends tell that Wu's revenge was cold and calculated, that she accused the empress of a terrible crime and watched as she was deposed. Whether the story is true or exaggerated by those who hated her, it became part of her legend, a woman capable of anything to claim her place beside the emperor. Once crowned empress, Wu transformed from a consort into a ruler in all but name. Gaozong's health declined, and she began to govern in his stead, sitting behind a curtain during court sessions, issuing edicts through his voice. Ministers soon learned that the true power of China sat not upon the dragon throne, but just behind it, cloaked in silk and shadow. Her reforms were radical. She promoted scholars based on merit rather than lineage, expanded education, and supported Buddhism, elevating it to a state faith. She built temples, sponsored art, and strengthened the empire's borders. Yet every act of progress came wrapped in fear. For each ally she gained, she made two enemies. The male courtiers, steeped in tradition, could not accept a woman wielding imperial authority. They called her a seductress, a usurper, a demon in human form. Pamphlets were circulated accusing her of witchcraft and murder. Yet Wu faced each accusation with composure. She understood that power does not ask for permission, it demands endurance. When her enemies plotted against her, they vanished quietly, their names struck from records, their families exiled to distant provinces. Mercy was a luxury she could not afford. After the emperor's death, she ruled through her sons, first as Empress Dowager, then as regent. But it was never enough. Eventually, she took the throne for herself, declaring the dawn of a new dynasty, the Zhou. The empire had never before bowed to a woman as its supreme ruler. The act shook China's ancient order to its core. Temples that once prayed for the emperor's glory now prayed for hers. Coins were minted with her name. The capital was filled with her image, her symbols, her decrees. She was both beloved and feared, the holy and divine empress, whose word could raise or destroy any man. And yet, even at the height of her rule, she remained an enigma. The chroniclers who followed her reign could not decide what she truly was, a visionary or a tyrant, a saint or a serpent. Her reforms lifted the poor and opened the bureaucracy to talent. Yet her purges filled prisons with blood. Her patronage of Buddhism turned monasteries into centers of learning. Yet her suppression of rivals silenced countless voices. She ruled not as a woman pretending to be a man, but as something new altogether, a sovereign who had transcended the boundaries of gender and tradition. In her old age, frail but unbroken, Wu Zetian began to withdraw from public life. She had ruled for nearly half a century, longer than most dynasties last. Even her enemies could not deny her brilliance, though they waited hungrily for her death. When it finally came, the Tang dynasty was restored, and the officials wasted no time erasing her name from monuments and records. Statues were toppled, inscriptions altered, histories rewritten. She was once again condemned as a usurper, her achievements hidden beneath layers of moral outrage. And yet, even erased, she refused to vanish. Her tomb stands near the city of Xi'an, monumental and mysterious. On her stone stele, where every other emperor's epitaph was inscribed with praise, hers is left blank, a silent challenge to history itself. No words could capture her. No judgment could define her. The blank stone speaks more clearly than any inscription. She needed no defense, no apology. Today, centuries later, her name glows faintly in the folds of memory. To some, she is still the ruthless empress who ruled through fear. To others, she is a symbol of defiance, a woman who claimed the heavens for herself in a world that denied her even a shadow of power. Her life is a study in contrasts, tenderness and cruelty, devotion and ambition, faith and control. When the wind passes through the old palace ruins of Luoyang, it carries a faint scent of incense and the whisper of silk. It is said that in the stillness before dawn, her spirit lingers there, poised, silent, watching the empire she once commanded. Wu Zetian remains a figure neither wholly admired nor entirely condemned, a sovereign who turned scandal into survival, and survival into legend. And as the stars fade over China's ancient lands, her story endures, a reminder that power, once tasted, is both poison and promise. In her rise and fall, we glimpse the eternal struggle between the boundaries of what is allowed and what is possible. And perhaps, beneath the layers of fear and reverence, we can still hear her whisper, that greatness, even when born of scandal, is still greatness, and that sometimes, to change the world, one must first dare to defy it. From the golden courts of China, our journey drifts westward once more, carried by the hush of wind and time, until it reaches the misty hills of medieval Scotland, a land wrapped in fog, legend, and blood. The air here feels colder, heavier, charged with the echoes of betrayal and ambition. Castles cling to cliffs like wounded giants, and their stones remember everything. The whispers of scheming nobles, the cries of doomed kings, the oaths spoken and broken beneath candlelight. Among these echoes rises the story of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, a woman born to rule, fated to fall, and remembered as both sinner and saint. Her life was a tapestry of passion and politics, scandal and sorrow, stitched together with threads of love and death. Mary was born into chaos. Her father, King James V of Scotland, died when she was only 6 days old, leaving her a crown before she could even open her eyes to the world. A tiny, fragile infant became a queen, and the kingdom trembled in uncertainty. In a land divided by faith and clan, power was both protection and curse. To secure her safety, Mary was sent to France, where she was raised amid silks, sonnets, and chivalry. The French court adored her, tall, graceful, with hair the color of copper and eyes that shifted like weather. She grew into a queen who embodied poetry itself. At 16, she married Francis, the Dauphin of France, and for a brief, shining moment, her life seemed destined for peace. When Francis became king, Mary became queen of both France and Scotland, a union that promised glory. But happiness, like sunlight on water, flickers and vanishes. Frances died within a year of their coronation, leaving her a widow before she was 18. The court that once adored her turned cold, and Mary, once the jewel of France, was now a foreign queen with no throne. So she returned to Scotland, her homeland, a land she had left as a child and now barely recognized. The mist greeted her like an old ghost, and the people watched her arrival with suspicion. She had been raised a Catholic in a nation turning Protestant. Her beauty, her elegance, her foreign ways, all of it became fodder for gossip. Yet Mary was not easily broken. She carried herself with grace, held her head high, and sought to rule with a balance of faith and diplomacy. But Scotland, fierce and divided, was not a land that welcomed balance. It demanded loyalty and punished weakness. Her first marriage in Scotland, to her cousin Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was meant to unite two royal bloodlines. Instead, it became the start of her downfall. Darnley was handsome, charming, and vain, a man who mistook privilege for power. At first, Mary adored him, believing their union might bring strength to her reign. But soon his arrogance and ambition revealed themselves. He demanded equal authority, grew jealous of her advisors, and drowned his insecurities in drink and violence. The tension between them grew darker with time. Then came the murder that would stain Mary's name forever. Her secretary, David Rizzio, a close confidant and rumored favorite, was dragged from her chambers and stabbed to death before her eyes by Darnley's allies. Mary, pregnant at the time, was held down as his blood soaked the floor. The court was horrified, yet Darnley showed no remorse. That night changed her completely. The softness that once charmed Europe hardened into resolve. Soon after, Darnley himself met a violent end. His house was torn apart by an explosion, and his body was found strangled in the garden, untouched by flame. The whispers began immediately that Mary had arranged his death to free herself from an unworthy husband. The truth remains lost to time, hidden beneath layers of fear and manipulation. What is known is that she soon married James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, the very man suspected of orchestrating Darnley's murder. The scandal was too great for even her crown to bear. The nobles turned against her, the people rioted, and Mary found herself imprisoned in her own castle, her crown stripped away and given to her infant son, James VI. From queen to captive, from mother to exile, her life unraveled like a song sung too often. She fled to England, seeking refuge from her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, a woman who understood power better than anyone, but who also saw Mary as a threat. They were two sides of the same coin, both queens by divine right, both unmarried, both symbols of nations at war with themselves. Yet where Elizabeth ruled with calculation, Mary ruled with heart. And in politics, heart is a dangerous thing. Elizabeth imprisoned her under the pretense of protection, but the truth was simpler. One queen's safety depended on the other's silence. For 19 years, Mary lived as a captive in England's cold stone fortresses. She wrote letters, prayed, embroidered, and waited. She was watched constantly, her words censored, her every movement reported. Yet even in confinement, her spirit did not fade. She became a figure of fascination, a Catholic martyr to some, a dangerous conspirator to others. Over time, her presence became a magnet for rebellion. Plots bloomed in her name, plans to free her, to assassinate Elizabeth, to place Mary on the English throne. Whether she encouraged them or not remains uncertain. But in the eyes of Elizabeth's court, suspicion was enough. One intercepted letter sealed her fate, a letter linking her, falsely or not, to a plan to kill Elizabeth. The verdict was inevitable. In the winter of 1587, at Fotheringhay Castle, Mary was sentenced to die. The woman who had once worn two crowns now stood on bare stone, facing her end with composure. On the morning of her execution, she dressed in crimson, the color of martyrdom. Her hands were steady, her eyes unflinching. She spoke calmly, forgiving her executioner, praying aloud as the blade rose. The first strike missed. The second ended it. The silence that followed was heavy, almost reverent. Yet death did not still her story. In the years that followed, Mary became a legend, part tragedy, part warning, part dream. To some, she was the embodiment of divine suffering, a queen destroyed by politics and fate. To others, she was reckless, her passions clouding her judgment. But perhaps both are true. For Mary lived not cautiously, but completely, loving deeply, ruling fiercely, and facing ruin with grace. Even now, in the Scottish mist, her presence lingers. In the ruins of Holyrood, In the camlet stones of Fotheringhay, in the whispered prayers of old cathedrals, she remains, not as a ghost, but as an echo of what it means to live fully in the face of inevitable loss. Her story is not one of innocence or guilt, but of humanity, of a queen who refused to bow quietly to her fate. And so, when the night deepens and the world grows still, her voice can almost be heard through the fog, soft, distant, proud. It says that crowns are fragile, hearts are dangerous, and history never sleeps. Mary Stuart, the scandalous, the tragic, the unforgettable, a queen whose life burned like a candle in the wind, and whose flame still flickers centuries later in the dark. The candlelight now flickers lower, its flame bending as if to whisper of a new story, one born not in castles of stone, but in the perfumed palaces of the Ottoman Empire. The air thickens with the scent of rosewater and oud, and in the distance, the faint call to prayer rises and fades like a sigh. Beyond the gates of Topkapi Palace, the world was a swirl of politics and poetry, of velvet intrigue and silken danger. Within those walls lived sultans who ruled continents, and women who ruled them. Among those women, one name shimmers with equal parts scandal and reverence: Hurrem Sultan, known in the West as Roxolana, the enslaved girl who became the queen of an empire and the most powerful woman the Ottoman world had ever seen. Her story begins far from Istanbul's glittering minarets. She was born Alexandra or Anastasia Lisowska in the cold lands of Ruthenia, where fields rolled under gray skies. Her childhood was ordinary, laughter by the hearth, church bells echoing in the distance, until raiders came. She was captured, torn from her family, and sold into slavery. The journey that followed was long and cruel. By the time she arrived in the bustling slave markets of Constantinople, she was just one among thousands, nameless, voiceless, stripped of identity. Yet destiny has a peculiar eye for the unlikely. At the imperial palace, the girls of the harem were trained to serve, to move with grace, to sing, to dance, to obey. But this girl was different. She carried herself with a brightness that could not be dimmed, a defiance that disguised itself as charm. Her laughter, rare in that world of restraint, echoed through the marble halls. They called her Hurrem, the joyful one. And soon, that joy caught the attention of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. He was the most powerful man in the known world, ruler of an empire that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia. He had concubines, wives, and advisors beyond count. But when Hurrem entered his life, the air around him changed. She was bold where others were shy, clever where others were silent. She spoke to him not as a subject to her master, but as a woman to a man. Within weeks, she became his favorite. Within months, his obsession. The empire whispered in disbelief. The Sultan had fallen in love. Their bond was unlike anything the court had seen. Hurrem was not only his lover, but his confidant, his equal in intellect and wit. She wrote him letters filled with poetry and longing, calling him her soul's joy. He, in turn, composed verses for her, comparing her eyes to the stars over Anatolia. Yet love in the Ottoman court was never private. Every gesture carried political weight. By breaking the ancient custom and marrying her, Suleiman scandalized his court. For centuries, sultans had taken concubines, but never wives, to avoid entangling the throne in personal attachments. Yet Hurrem became his legal wife, his Hasiki Sultan, a title that had never existed before her. Her rise to power was swift and dizzying. From the shadows of the harem, she stepped into the center of the empire's politics. She bore Suleiman several sons, each a potential heir, and soon the palace was divided by quiet wars. The harem was not simply a household. It was a world of rival factions, spies, alliances, and poison. Every smile hid calculation. Hurrem's greatest rival was Mahidevran, Suleiman's former favorite and the mother of his eldest son, Mustafa. The tension between them grew into silent, simmering warfare. Hurrem's influence expanded beyond the harem walls. She corresponded with foreign rulers, sponsored architects, funded mosques, and charitable works. She turned her position, once the mark of enslavement, into a source of authority. But her power came at a cost. The struggle for succession tore at the royal family. When Mustafa, beloved by the army and the people, was accused of plotting against his father, Hurrem's name appeared in every whisper. Some say she manipulated events to protect her own sons. Others say Suleiman's paranoia doomed his heir. Whatever the truth, Mustafa was executed, strangled by his father's order. The empire wept, and Hurrem was blamed. The joyful one, they said, had become the serpent of the palace. Yet to view her only through the lens of cruelty would be to miss the full measure of her story. Hurrem used her influence to soften the empire's edges, commissioning hospitals, schools, and public baths for women, works that still stand centuries later. She counseled Suleiman on matters of diplomacy and religion, often urging mercy where others demanded conquest. She was a reformer cloaked in silk, a strategist who understood that empires are not ruled by swords alone, but by perception. Her letters reveal a woman of deep feeling and shrewd awareness. In one, she wrote, "My heart burns with longing, for without you, I am but a body without a soul." It was not the language of politics, but of devotion, and yet, through it, she wielded power greater than any vizier. She was both a lover and an empire builder, her heart and mind working in perfect, dangerous harmony. As she aged, her influence endured, even as her health declined. Suleiman's affection never wavered. When she died, he buried her beside the mosque she had built in Istanbul, a rare honor for a woman. Her tomb still stands today, beside his, their domes facing the same sky. Visitors who enter find her resting place fragrant with incense and silence, her epitaph carved in delicate calligraphy, beloved of Suleiman. But her true legacy lies in the ripples she left behind. The centuries that followed would be shaped by women like her, powerful, cunning, and unafraid. The era that began with Hurrem came to be known as the Sultanate of Women, when mothers and wives of sultans wielded real authority in the empire's affairs. From the depths of captivity, she had redefined what power could mean for a woman, not by defying the system, but by mastering it. Still, the stories of her life remain divided between reverence and suspicion. To some, she was a manipulator who poisoned the empire's future. To others, a visionary who brought compassion to a ruthless age. Perhaps she was both, as most who touch power tend to be. For in Hurrem Sultan, we see the eternal paradox of rule, that light and shadow are often born of the same flame. At night, when the Bosphorus glitters beneath the moon and the call to prayer drifts across the water, one might imagine her spirit moving through the palace corridors, her laughter echoing faintly through the domes. Once a slave, then a queen, always a mystery. Her story hums softly through time like a lullaby carried by the sea, reminding us that history's most scandalous figures are often its most human, and that love, in its fiercest form, can bend even empires to its will. The story drifts west again, over sunlit seas and the marble columns of forgotten temples, to the heart of Renaissance England, an age of poetry and treachery, of silk and steel. Here, power was performed like theater, and the stage was the royal court of King Henry VIII. Behind its glittering facade lay a world of whispers, where a misplaced glance could end a life and a smile could rewrite destiny. In this court of calculated beauty and peril, one woman rose higher than any dared, only to fall with breathtaking speed. Her name was Anne Boleyn, a queen whose ambition reshaped a nation, whose scandal shattered a church, and whose ghost still lingers in the corridors of English history. Anne's beginning was far from the throne. Born into a family of ambition but not of royalty, she was sent to the courts of Europe as a girl, first to the Netherlands, then to France, where she learned grace, wit, and the quiet power of charm. She returned to England not as a naive maiden, but as a woman refined by culture and intellect. Her eyes held secrets, her laughter hinted at mischief, and her mind, sharp as glass, could slice through pretense. In a world where women were meant to be silent ornaments, and was aflame, unpredictable, captivating, and dangerous to touch. When Henry VIII first noticed her, he was already married to Catherine of Aragon, his queen of 20 years. But Catherine, devout and dignified, had failed to give him a living son. The king's heart, restless and proud, began to wander, and in Anne, he found both fascination and frustration. Unlike other women, she refused to be his mistress. She did not yield, she calculated. She would not give him her body without a crown. It was not arrogance, it was strategy. She understood that to win his love was not enough. She had to win his respect. Her resistance only deepened his obsession. Henry's letters to her, still preserved, pulse with longing and impatience. "My heart and I surrender ourselves into your hands," he wrote, "beseeching you to hold us under your protection." Yet beneath the poetry lay danger, for the king was not a man used to denial. Years passed, filled with clandestine meetings, glances stolen across banquets, and promises whispered in secret. Their love, or what passed for it, ignited a revolution. To marry Anne, Henry sought an annulment from Catherine, but the Pope refused. What followed was a scandal that would alter the very soul of England. Henry broke from Rome, declared himself the head of the Church of England, and made Anne his queen. In doing so, he split his kingdom's faith, defied centuries of papal authority, and plunged his people into decades of religious turmoil. All for a woman who had captivated his will. At her coronation in 1533, the crowds watched with fascination and unease. She glowed in gold, radiant and triumphant, but the air was heavy with judgment. To many, she was not a queen, but a witch, a usurper, the serpent who had ensnared their king. The whispers began at once, of dark magic, of seduction, of pride. But Anne was not cowed. She carried herself with the poise of one who knew her worth. Let them talk, she might have thought, for they will talk regardless. Her power, for a time, seemed limitless. Ministers courted her favor, poets sang her praises, foreign ambassadors feared her influence. She spoke her mind in matters of state, sometimes sharply, sometimes too sharply. Even Henry, who had broken a kingdom for her, began to bristle at her temper. But the weight of the crown was heavier than she could have imagined. She bore Henry a daughter, Elizabeth, a child destined for greatness, but no son. Miscarriages followed, each one deepening Henry's disappointment and rage. The court grew cold. Enemies gathered like crows. Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, turned against her when she challenged his political reforms. Her charm, once intoxicating, began to curdle in the public eye. Rumors spread that she was unfaithful, that she flirted too boldly, that her laughter hid betrayal. The same brilliance that had lifted her up now painted her as dangerous. In May 1536, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason, charges so wild they seemed designed more to humiliate than to convince. She was taken to the Tower of London, the very fortress she had entered years earlier as a queen. Now its gray walls closed around her as a prisoner. Witnesses later said she remained composed, even serene. "I do not intend to die for having offended the king," she told her jailers, "but for not having pleased him." Her trial was a performance, the verdict inevitable. On the morning of May 19th, she dressed in gray damask, her hair bound beneath a white linen coif. She ascended the scaffold with quiet dignity, facing a small crowd of courtiers, guards, and strangers. Her last words were soft, gracious even. She spoke no bitterness against Henry, no defense of herself, only prayers for mercy. Then, kneeling before a French swordsman brought to ensure a swift death, she whispered, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul." One clean stroke ended her life. But death could not silence her. The daughter she bore, the child for whom she had risked everything, would grow to become Elizabeth I, the greatest monarch England had ever known. Through Elizabeth, Anne's spirit endured, her intelligence, her determination, her defiance. The woman once condemned as a temptress became, through time, the mother of a golden age. Yet even centuries later, and Bullen remains an enigma. Was she manipulative or misunderstood? A schemer or a survivor? Perhaps she was both, as all who rise too high must be. The tragedy of Anne's life is that her ambition and brilliance, so rare for a woman of her age, became the very weapons used to destroy her. History remembers her not as she was, but as others needed her to be, a warning, a myth, a martyr. In the quiet halls of Hever Castle, where she spent her youth, the air still seems to hum with her presence. The wind through the tapestries carries a faint echo of her laughter, a whisper of silk along stone. And in the Tower of London, it is said that her ghost still walks, head held high, her calm defiance undimmed by time. And Bullen's story is not just of love and betrayal, but of transformation. She reshaped the fabric of her nation, forced kings and cardinals to reckon with the will of a woman, and through her death, ensured that England would never be the same. She remains both warning and inspiration, proof that scandal and greatness often share the same breath. And as night deepens over the Thames, the river reflecting the stars like fragments of shattered crowns, one might imagine her voice drifting softly through the dark, not in sorrow, but in triumph. For though the blade silenced her body, her story, her fire, still burns quietly in the soul of history. The night turns warmer now, and the rhythm of the story changes. The echo of Europe's marble palaces fades into the pulse of the Caribbean, a world of color, rhythm, and rebellion. Palm leaves whisper in the humid wind. The air smells of salt, sugar, and smoke. This is the age of colonies, of empires built on stolen soil and stolen souls. And amid that cruel splendor lived a queen unlike any other, a woman born into captivity who became an empress of legend. Her name was Marie Laveau, the voodoo queen of New Orleans, and her reign was both feared and adored. Her story begins in the early 1800s, when New Orleans was a city caught between worlds. French, Spanish, African, and indigenous cultures blended into something entirely new, a place where Catholic saints and African spirits shared the same altars. The streets were alive with sound, the clatter of hooves, the hum of markets, the hymns rising from churches, and the deep, secret rhythms of the drum. In this world of shadows and light, Marie was born, a free woman of color, descended from both slaves and their masters. From the beginning, she carried an aura that drew people to her. Her presence was calm but commanding. Her eyes, they said, could read the soul. She worked as a hairdresser for the city's elite, a position that placed her near the center of gossip and power. While brushing the curls of wealthy Creole women, she listened to their confessions, their fears, their secrets. It was said that she knew everything that happened in New Orleans before it was even spoken aloud. But it was her gift, or curse, as some called it, that made her a legend. Marie was a practitioner of voodoo, a faith born from Africa's shores, carried through the horror of slavery, and remade in the crucible of the New World. To the frightened and the faithful alike, she was the bridge between worlds, the visible and the invisible, the living and the spirits. She held ceremonies in Congo Square, where drums beat like the heartbeat of the city and dancers spun in ecstasy beneath the moon. People came to her for blessings, for healing, for revenge, for love. To some, she was a saint, to others a witch. The line between magic and manipulation blurred easily in New Orleans. Marie understood that belief itself was a kind of power. Her rituals were as much performance as prayer. Candles flickering beside Catholic icons, snakes coiled around altars, chants rising into the humid night. The wealthy came to her in secret, slipping coins into her hand for potions or charms. The poor came openly, seeking hope. She became the city's unseen queen, her influence stretching from the markets of Treme to the marble mansions along St. Charles Avenue. But power, in any form, invites fear. The authorities called her dangerous. The church called her heretic. Yet none dared to challenge her openly. Her knowledge of secrets, of affairs, crimes, debts, and sins gave her protection no crown could grant. When police raided her gatherings, they often found only candles, rosaries, and prayers to the Virgin Mary. To outsiders, it looked like harmless devotion. To those who knew, it was something deeper, a merging of worlds, a quiet rebellion dressed as worship. Her greatest gift was not sorcery, but understanding. She knew that true control came not from curses or charms, but from a theater of power. She built an image around herself, the mysterious queen, draped in white linen, moving through the French Quarter with snakes wrapped around her wrists and whispers following in her wake. People spoke of her miracles, of men cured, lovers reunited, enemies undone. Whether these tales were real or born of all hardly mattered. What mattered was that everyone believed. Yet beneath the legend was a woman of contradictions. She was a devout Catholic who attended Mass every Sunday, yet she served spirits the church condemned. She lived modestly, yet her influence reached the highest echelons of society. She helped the enslaved and the sick, yet she also moved comfortably among the powerful who upheld those very hierarchies. Her life was an endless dance between sin and sanctity, survival and transcendence. As the years passed, her legend grew. Some said she could appear in two places at once, that she spoke with the dead, that she could summon storms. Even the skeptics, the men of science and reason, hesitated to speak ill of her, for fear, perhaps, of tempting her spirit. But time, as always, weaves its quiet spell. When Marie grew old, her body frail and her steps slow, people began to wonder how long her reign would last. And when she finally died in 1881, the city mourned not just a woman, but an era. Her funeral at St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 was said to draw thousands. They came from every corner of the city, priests, beggars, merchants, and mothers. Candles burned for days, their wax pooling like tears on the marble. But death could not contain her. Soon after, people began claiming to see her walking through the French Quarter at dusk, her white headscarf gleaming faintly under the gaslights. Offerings began to appear at her tomb. Coins, rum, flowers, voodoo dolls, placed there by those seeking her help even beyond the grave. Today, her resting place remains one of the most visited graves in America. Pilgrims come to whisper wishes against the stone, marking 3 X's in her honor. Some say the air there feels heavier, charged with warmth and warning. The line between superstition and faith blurs as easily now as it did 2 centuries ago. For Marie Laveau, even in death, remains the heartbeat of a city that thrives on mystery. Her story, like the religion she shaped, refuses to be simplified. She was neither wholly holy nor wholly profane. She was both, as most great figures of history are. A woman who claimed her own power in a time when women, especially women of color, were meant to be invisible. Through her, the enslaved and the oppressed found a voice, a ritual, a way to survive. Through her, faith itself became an act of rebellion. And as the night deepens over New Orleans, her presence still hums in the air, in the distant drumming of street performers, in the flicker of candles left by strangers, in the murmur of stories told over jazz and rain. Her scandal was not her sorcery, but her sovereignty. She took what the world denied her, control, reverence, immortality, and made it her own. If you stand quietly in the quarter at midnight, they say you can still feel her gaze, not cruel, but knowing. The voodoo queen of New Orleans, watching her city breathe, still guarding her people, still reigning in a kingdom that exists between the living and the dead. The night thickens, the air cools, and the echoes of New Orleans begin to fade, giving way to the cold, stark landscapes of Eastern Europe. Here, in the misted valleys and shadowed forests of Transylvania, a figure looms, not just in history, but in myth. Her name is often whispered in fear, her legacy written in blood and darkness. She was born to power, privilege, and tragedy. She was Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess, and her life, shrouded in scandal and suspicion, has become a tale of the darkest depths of human nature. Born in 1560 into one of the most powerful families in Hungary, Elizabeth was a child of wealth and influence. Her lineage was noble, with ties to both the royal family of Hungary and the Habsburgs. She was raised in the opulence of the Bathory estates, surrounded by luxury and a court that demanded grace and intellect. From a young age, Elizabeth was taught how to wield power, how to speak in courts, how to manage land and estates, and how to deal with the intricacies of politics. Her early life, though clouded by the strict rules of nobility, appeared to be one of promise, a future filled with elegance and influence. At the age of 15, Elizabeth was married to the Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a soldier of great renown. Their union was both an alliance and a personal bond. Ferenc was often away fighting in the wars with the Ottoman Empire, leaving Elizabeth to oversee the vast Bathory estates. It was during this time, alone in the grand castle of Cactus, that rumors of her cruelty began to take root. But it was not until her husband's death in 1604 that the true horror of Elizabeth's reign would begin to unfold. Without Ferenc at her side, Elizabeth's isolation deepened. Her behavior grew increasingly erratic, and the grandeur of her estates gave way to a darkness that seemed to spread with each passing year. The details of her actions are horrific, and even today, the truth remains blurred by myth and legend. What is known is that Elizabeth Bathory was accused of the brutal torture and murder of young girls. Some sources claim she believed that bathing in their blood would preserve her youth, while others suggest that her cruelty was fueled by power, privilege, and unchecked madness. The accounts from her servants and those who lived near the castle paint a chilling picture of screams echoing in the night, of girls lured into the castle under the guise of service, only to meet a brutal end. Some claim that Elizabeth's obsession with beauty was what pushed her to these horrific extremes. The idea of eternal youth and beauty, a desire deeply entrenched in the world of the aristocracy, consumed her. Her obsession with blood may have begun as a desperate attempt to preserve her appearance, a belief in the supernatural that fed her cruelty. Some say that she believed the blood of young girls could halt the ravages of time, that it could restore her fading beauty. Whether or not this is true remains unknown. What is certain, however, is that Elizabeth's cruelty became legendary. The numbers attributed to her, hundreds, some say even thousands, vary greatly, but the horror of her crimes became undeniable. In 1610, Elizabeth's reign of terror came to an abrupt end. The king, Matthias II, ordered an investigation into her actions after numerous reports from villagers, servants, and former confidants of the countess's cruelty. What was uncovered was a network of terror hidden within the walls of her castle. The bodies of young girls were found, some butchered beyond recognition, others left to die in squalid conditions. Those who were accused of aiding Elizabeth in her heinous acts were arrested, tortured, and executed. But Elizabeth, despite her noble blood, was not sentenced to death. Instead, she was imprisoned in the very castle where so much horror had unfolded. Her imprisonment was a strange and tragic end to the life of a woman who had once held so much power. She was locked away in a small room within Cactus Castle, and it was here that she spent the last years of her life, confined to the walls of her own making. In the silence of that isolation, Elizabeth Bathory died in 1614, a woman who had once commanded armies and ruled vast estates, now a prisoner of her own past. Her legacy is one of the most chilling and perplexing in history. The name Blood Countess still rings through the annals of time, associated with the darkest of human actions. But even in death, Elizabeth's story is riddled with contradictions. Was she truly a sadistic murderer, or was she the victim of a campaign to discredit her? Some scholars suggest that her crimes were exaggerated by political rivals, that her noble family's enemies used her as a pawn in a larger game of power. Others argue that the tales of her bloodlust were distorted by superstition, religious fervor, and the fear of a powerful woman in an age where women had few rights. The truth of Elizabeth Bathory's life is elusive. Did she truly believe that bathing in blood would preserve her youth? Or was this an invention of those who wished to vilify her? Was she a madwoman driven to insanity by grief and power? Or was she a victim of a system that allowed such power to fester unchecked? The dark shadow of her story continues to haunt the corners of Transylvania, and Cactus Castle still stands as a monument to her tragic reign. In the quiet of the night, when the wind howls through the trees, one can almost hear the whispers of her name carried on the air. Was she a queen of darkness, a woman who reveled in her cruelty and lust for blood, or was she a tragic figure who became a symbol of the destructive power of unchecked privilege? In the silence of the mist, the answer remains as murky as the waters of the Tisa River, flowing dark and deep, carrying with it the secrets of a time long past. What is certain is that Elizabeth Bathory, for all her atrocities or her potential innocence, remains one of the most enigmatic and haunting figures in history. Her name, like the cold winds of Transylvania, lingers in the dark, a reminder of the fine line between legend and truth, between power and madness, between the real and the imagined. And in the stillness of the night, as the wind whispers through the trees, her shadow still looms, a figure lost to time, yet never fully erased. Deep in the heart of Eastern Europe, amid the rugged mountains and mist-covered valleys of Transylvania, a figure casts a long shadow across history, one whose name still sends a chill through the bones of those who dare speak it. Elizabeth Bathory, often remembered as the Blood Countess, is a woman whose legacy is one of the most horrific, yet fascinating, in the annals of time. Her name is synonymous with cruelty, with bloodshed, and with a reign of terror that seems more like myth than history. Yet, the truth of her life, like the fog that rolls across the Carpathian Mountains, remains thick with uncertainty. Was she a sadistic murderer, a madwoman consumed by power? Or was she the victim of a political conspiracy, a woman whose status and wealth became the fuel for the fire of her downfall? Born into the powerful Bathory family in 1560, Elizabeth's early life seemed destined for greatness. She was a member of Hungary's nobility, linked to some of the most influential families in Europe, including the Habsburgs. Raised in a world of power, wealth, and political intrigue, Elizabeth was taught how to manage estates, interact with the royal court, and navigate the treacherous waters of European politics. From a young age, she was groomed to be a leader, expected to be intelligent, poised, and capable of commanding both her household and the territories under her care. In 1575, Elizabeth married Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a well-known soldier who served in the wars against the Ottoman Empire. This union solidified her position in Hungarian society and brought her further wealth and influence. However, much of her marriage was marked by Ferenc's long absences as he fought in military campaigns. During these periods of solitude, Elizabeth took on a more prominent role in the administration of her lands, becoming a powerful figure in her own right. But beneath the surface of this seemingly prosperous marriage, something darker began to take root. While her husband was away, Elizabeth's behavior began to shift. Slowly, her actions became more erratic, her demeanor colder. She started to retreat deeper into her estates, keeping herself surrounded by a small, loyal group of servants and confidants. And as her isolation grew, so too did the whispers of cruelty that followed her. The first rumors of Elizabeth's violent tendencies began to circulate in the early 1600s, but it wasn't until the death of her husband in 1604 that the true extent of her depravity came to light. With Ferenc gone, Elizabeth was left to manage the vast Bathory holdings alone, and it was during this time that the tales of her sadistic acts began to take a darker turn. The accounts are varied, but many speak of young girls who were lured to her castle under the guise of employment, only to meet horrific fates. The stories told of torture, mutilation, and murder, all allegedly carried out by Elizabeth herself or by those she employed to do her bidding. But what set Elizabeth apart from other historical figures accused of such atrocities was the nature of the violence she reportedly inflicted. It was said that she believed that bathing in the blood of young virgins would preserve her youth and beauty, an obsession with vanity that led to her being labeled as a blood countess. Whether this belief was a product of her own delusions or whether it was a convenient narrative constructed by her enemies is still a matter of debate. What is clear is that she became infamous for her cruelty, and as the reports of her actions spread, the true horror of her reign began to unfold. In 1610, after several years of growing suspicion, a formal investigation was launched into Elizabeth Bathory's activities. The charges against her were shocking: murder, torture, and the abuse of young girls, among others. The details of the investigation are as chilling as the crimes themselves. It is said that when authorities arrive at her castles, they found evidence of the brutal treatment of girls. Some are found dead, others disfigured beyond recognition, and many were reportedly kept in captivity. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Elizabeth was not immediately arrested. Her noble status shielded her to some extent, but the pressure from local officials, fueled by public outcry, eventually led to her being detained. However, rather than facing a public trial, Elizabeth was placed under house arrest in her castle. The trial never came to fruition, and Elizabeth was not executed, as might have been expected. Instead, she spent her final years in isolation, confined to her own home, where she reportedly died in 1614. Her death did not end the speculation surrounding her life. Over the centuries, historians, scholars, and storytellers have been divided on how to interpret Elizabeth's legacy. Was she truly the sadistic, bloodthirsty woman portrayed in many historical accounts? Or was she the victim of a conspiracy, a pawn in a larger political struggle? Some argue that her downfall was the result of a power struggle within the nobility, a case of wealthy, influential enemies conspiring to discredit her. Others suggest that Elizabeth's behavior was exaggerated and distorted by the Catholic Church, which had its own motives for demonizing her, particularly given her powerful position and her perceived heretical acts. Moreover, some have proposed that Elizabeth's alleged crimes were simply the result of her mental state. Was she a victim of some form of psychological illness, or perhaps the trauma of losing her beloved husband and the pressures of managing vast estates in an age of war and upheaval? The mystery of her motivations remains unsolved, and as with many figures of legend, the lines between truth and fiction blur. Yet the image of the Blood Countess endures, fueled by centuries of storytelling, books, and films that have woven Elizabeth's story into the fabric of horror and folklore. Her name has become synonymous with madness and bloodshed, a woman driven to insanity by her desire for eternal beauty and her hunger for power. Whether she was the perpetrator of the horrific acts ascribed to her or simply a victim of the world around her, Elizabeth Bathory's legacy is undeniably tragic. She remains a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power, the thin line between nobility and madness, and the way history can twist even the most complex lives into grotesque myths. Today, her castle at Cactus stands as a grim reminder of her once mighty reign. Though it is now a ruin, the stones seem to hold the echoes of her actions, and the place is often visited by those who wish to understand her story, or perhaps to catch a glimpse of the ghost of the infamous Countess herself. Some say that the spirits of the young girls she is believed to have murdered still haunt the area, seeking revenge for the cruelties they endured in life. Elizabeth Bathory's story continues to captivate, horrify, and mystify all who encounter it. Was she a wicked queen of darkness, consumed by her desires, or a tragic figure who fell victim to the forces of political intrigue, superstition, and societal expectations? The truth remains elusive, hiding in the shadows of history, like the mist that shrouds the mountain tops of Transylvania. Even today, as night falls over the land, her name echoes through the woods, a spectral reminder of the dangers that lie at the intersection of myth, madness, and power. As the night unfolds further, we leave behind the dark legends of Transylvania and travel toward the windswept plains of northern Europe. Here, in the midst of history, another woman's story rests, a tale intertwined with ambition, betrayal, and a thirst for power. This is the story of Catherine de' Medici, the Queen of France whose life was defined by political intrigue, ruthless tactics, and a mastery of courtly manipulation. Hers is a legacy marked by both grandeur and darkness, where the line between statesmanship and cruelty often blurred into one chilling tale. Born in 1519 into the opulent Medici family of Florence, Catherine was raised in a world of wealth, art, and diplomacy. But despite her noble birth, her life was far from secure. Her early years were shaped by loss and political instability. Her father, Lorenzo de' Medici, died before she could even remember him, and her mother, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, was from a lesser noble family. When she was just a child, Catherine's life took a sudden, tragic turn. Her cousin, Pope Clement VII, was embroiled in a power struggle with the mighty Holy Roman Emperor, and in a series of political maneuvers, Catherine was married off to Henry, the future King of France. This marriage, though seemingly fortuitous, was far more than a union of love. It was a strategic alliance that would propel Catherine into the highest echelons of European politics. When she married Henry in 1533, Catherine was just 14 years old. She was initially a mere pawn in the complex chessboard of European dynasties. But over the years, she quickly proved herself to be far more than just a political tool. Henry, who was initially captivated by his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, did not shower Catherine with affection, and she was left in the shadows of the royal court. Despite this, Catherine began to gain influence. She was shrewd, intelligent, and possessed a keen understanding of the political currents that flowed through the courts of France. She learned the art of intrigue, of subtle manipulation, and of power, and as her marriage progressed, she began to turn these skills to her advantage. When Henry died suddenly in 1559, Catherine was thrust into the role of queen mother to her son, Charles IX. This event marked a turning point in her life and in French history. With the kingdom's throne now in the hands of a vulnerable young monarch, Catherine saw an opportunity to assert her influence. The French court was rife with tension and conflict. The Protestant Reformation had shaken the foundations of Europe, and France was no exception. Catholics and Protestants, known as Huguenots, were locked in a brutal struggle for supremacy. Catherine, seeking to maintain her power and protect her family, found herself trapped in the political maelstrom. She was forced to navigate a dangerous game of diplomacy, where every decision was fraught with peril and every ally could turn into a deadly enemy. Her most infamous act of manipulation, however, came in 1572 with the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. This event, still one of the darkest in French history, saw thousands of Huguenots slaughtered in a single night of violence. The massacre was not just an act of blind religious hatred, but a calculated political maneuver by Catherine and her supporters. At the time, France was in the throes of a civil war between Catholics and Protestants, and Catherine, seeing the Huguenots as a growing threat to her son's rule, ordered the massacre. The night of August 24th, 1572, remains seared in history as one of the most horrifying chapters in the annals of European violence. The massacre began in Paris and quickly spread across the country. Hundreds of Huguenots who had gathered in the capital for a wedding were systematically rounded up, imprisoned, and executed. The blood ran in the streets, and the sound of clanging swords and shrieking victims filled the air. It was a moment of extreme brutality, but for Catherine, it was a moment of triumph. The massacre weakened the Protestant movement in France and solidified her family's grip on power. To some, this was evidence of Catherine's ruthless ambition. To others, it was proof of her survival instincts in a world where only the most cunning could thrive. But the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was just one chapter in a life full of dark deeds. Catherine's reign as Queen Mother was marked by continuous power struggles, shifting alliances, and the constant threat of rebellion. She was a woman who understood that in the world of politics, weakness was a fatal flaw. She ruled the court not with brute force, but with an intricate web of alliances, betrayals, and the careful manipulation of information. She was skilled in the arts of espionage and psychological warfare, using spies, rumors, and secrets to control the course of events in her favor. Her enemies were many, and she was not above using cruelty to maintain control. Her ability to outmaneuver opponents and secure her family's position at court became legendary. She was often accused of poisoning her rivals and orchestrating the deaths of those who posed a threat to her son's rule. Some of these claims are difficult to verify, but they fed into the image of Catherine as a woman who was willing to do anything, no matter how ruthless, to protect her power. Yet, despite her ruthless methods, Catherine's legacy is not purely one of darkness. She was also a patron of the arts and a great lover of culture. Under her guidance, the French Renaissance flourished. She commissioned the construction of lavish gardens and palaces, and she brought the great artists of the time to her court. Her influence extended beyond politics and into the realms of art, science, and architecture. Her court became a place of intellectual and cultural exchange, and she was known to support painters, sculptors, and philosophers. In her final years, Catherine's health began to deteriorate, and her grip on power weakened. She died in 1589, leaving behind a France in turmoil. Her children continued to rule. Her son Henry III, and later her granddaughter, Marie de Medici, who would become Queen of France. But the country was still scarred by the violence and bloodshed that had characterized her reign. Today, Catherine de Medici remains one of the most enigmatic figures in European history. She is often seen as a symbol of political cunning and cruelty, a woman whose ambition led her to take extreme measures to secure her power. Yet, at the same time, she was a mother, a patron, and a ruler who sought to protect her family and secure her legacy. Her story is one of contradictions, a woman capable of both great cruelty and great kindness, a queen who wielded power with precision and without mercy. Her life has inspired countless books, films, and television series, where her complex character is depicted as both a villain and a victim, a mastermind and a martyr. For all the darkness that surrounds her name, there is an undeniable fascination with Catherine de Medici, a queen who shaped the course of French history with her ambition, her cunning, and her unmatched ability to manipulate the world around her. In the silent echoes of history, Catherine's presence lingers, like the faint trace of perfume in a room long emptied. A woman who, for all her ambition and ambition alone, left an indelible mark on the world. In the midst of Tudor England, where crowns changed hands like passing shadows, the story of Lady Jane Grey flickers like a candle against a cold stone wall. She was not born to rule, yet history placed the crown upon her trembling head. At just 16, quiet, learned, and devout, she became the 9 Days Queen, a title as brief as it was tragic. Jane was drawn into the ambitions of powerful men who saw her not as a girl, but as a symbol, a Protestant heir to block Queen Mary's claim. When King Edward VI died, Jane was proclaimed queen, bewildered and unwilling, her soft words lost beneath the roar of politics. Within days, the tide turned. Mary's supporters gathered, the people's loyalty shifting like wind. The crown slipped away as swiftly as it had come. Imprisoned in the Tower of London, Jane waited calmly for the end. Her letters from captivity spoke not of regret for lost power, but of faith and quiet acceptance. On a gray February morning in 1554, she faced the scaffold. The girl who never sought a throne walked with grace to her death, her voice steady, her courage pure. The axe fell, and England moved on, yet her name endured, etched not in triumph, but in tenderness. Jane Grey became a symbol of innocence caught in the machinery of ambition, of purity destroyed by politics. Her brief life reminds us that power is fleeting and that even a queen can be forgotten in a single breath of time. Beyond the tragic figure of Lady Jane Grey, the path of forgotten royalty winds onward into the 18th century. a period when Europe's crowns gleamed brightly, but hid beneath them the dull ache of disillusion, decay, and rebellion. It is here, in the twilight years of the French monarchy, that we meet one of history's most misunderstood and polarizing queens, Marie Antoinette. Her name alone conjures 1,000 images: diamonds, silks, towering wigs, and whispered scandals echoing through the gilded halls of Versailles. Yet beneath the glitter and the gossip lay a woman trapped by circumstance, blamed for an empire's decline, and immortalized as the face of royal excess. Her story, at once sumptuous and tragic, unfolds like a candle flickering before the storm of revolution. Marie Antoinette was born in 1755 in Vienna, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Emperor Francis I. From the moment of her birth, her life was destined for politics. At just 14, she was sent to France to marry the Dauphin, the future King Louis XVI. Her marriage was not born of love, but of diplomacy, a union designed to secure peace between two great empires that had long been rivals. As she crossed the Rhine into France, she left behind everything she had ever known. Even her Austrian clothes were stripped from her. She was redressed in French silk before setting foot on her new homeland soil. It was the symbolic beginning of her new life, one that would eventually consume her. At first, the young Dauphine charmed everyone she met. She was radiant, playful, and effortlessly elegant, embodying the allure of youth and the promise of a renewed monarchy. The French court, however, was a labyrinth of etiquette, power games, and whispered betrayals. Every gesture was scrutinized, every word dissected. The young queen quickly learned that she was as much a spectacle as she was a sovereign. When she became queen in 1774, after Louis ascended to the throne, she was barely 19. France was teetering on the edge of financial ruin, its people burdened with poverty, while the nobility basked in decadence. In this environment of instability, Marie Antoinette's lavish taste became a target of public outrage. Her penchant for extravagant gowns, jewels, and elaborate entertainments earned her the derisive nickname Madame Deficit. She spent vast sums on the latest fashions, on redesigning her personal estate at the Petit Trianon, and on throwing lavish parties that dazzled Europe's elite. To her, these were small pleasures in a lonely and scrutinized life. To her subjects, they were symbols of everything wrong with the monarchy. The rumors surrounding Marie Antoinette grew darker as France's discontent deepened. Pamphleteers spread salacious tales of her affairs, her alleged indifference to the plight of the people, and her supposed hunger for power. The most infamous of these was the legend that she had dismissed the starving cries of her people with the callous words, "Let them eat cake." In reality, there is no historical evidence she ever said such a thing, but the phrase became a weapon, a symbol of her perceived arrogance and ignorance. It was easier for a suffering nation to hate a face than to confront the complex systems of corruption and inequality that truly led to their despair. As the storm of revolution began to gather, Marie Antoinette's gilded world began to crumble. Her husband, Louis XVI, was indecisive and ill-suited to rule. The court was rife with division, and the treasury was nearly empty. The queen, still trying to navigate her public image, retreated further into her private world, surrounding herself with a small circle of confidants. Her once glittering life became shadowed by fear and rumor. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, the Palace of Versailles, once the symbol of absolute monarchy, was stormed by angry mobs demanding bread, justice, and freedom. Marie Antoinette and her family were forced to flee to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, effectively prisoners of their own people. The years that followed were filled with humiliation, failed escape attempts, and the slow, inevitable unraveling of royal authority. Despite everything, Marie Antoinette's demeanor during these dark years astonished many who had once despised her. Gone was the frivolous young queen obsessed with gowns and gossip. In her place stood a woman of quiet strength and dignity, fiercely protective of her children and steadfast beside her husband as their world fell apart. But revolution has no mercy for symbols. In 1792, the monarchy was abolished and the royal family was imprisoned in the Temple Tower. Louis XVI was executed by guillotine in January 1793, and Marie Antoinette, now the widow Capet, followed 9 months later. Her final days were marked by both cruelty and grace. She endured relentless interrogation and public ridicule. Yet those who witnessed her final moments spoke of her composure and courage. On October 16, 1793, she was led through the jeering crowds to the Place de la Révolution. Her once golden hair had turned white during her imprisonment. As she ascended the scaffold, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot and, in a final act of grace, whispered, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." A moment later, the blade fell, and the Queen's life ended. The crowd erupted, not in triumph, but in something closer to awe. A woman who had once represented everything they hated had, in her final breath, reclaimed her humanity. In death, Marie Antoinette became something else entirely, a figure caught between villain and victim, opulence and tragedy. Over the centuries, historians have debated her true nature. Was she truly the heartless queen who danced as her people starved, or was she a scapegoat for a crumbling system that had been doomed long before she arrived in France? The truth, as always, lies somewhere between. Today, her story feels almost cinematic in its contrasts. The glittering chandeliers of Versailles against the bleak gray of the guillotine's shadow, the laughter of court musicians fading into the cries of the revolution. Marie Antoinette's life is not just the story of a queen who fell from grace. It is the story of a world changing irrevocably, of the end of divine monarchy and the birth of modern democracy. And yet, even now, her name lingers in whispers, carried by the scent of roses and powder, echoing in the empty halls of Versailles. She remains an emblem of beauty and tragedy, innocence and guilt, a queen who, despite her flaws, became immortal not through power, but through the enduring fascination with her fall. In the silence after her death, the question lingers: was she a monster made by rumor, or a young woman lost in the storm of history? As with so many of the kings and queens whose stories we've told, the truth rests somewhere in the half-light between myth and memory, forever unresolved, forever haunting. The night grows still. The echoes of royal footsteps fade into the corridors of history. The scandals and sorrows of forgotten monarchs, once burning bright, now rest in the hush of remembrance. Crowns have tarnished, empires have crumbled, yet their stories linger like faint perfume in the dark. Each ruler we have met was both mighty and fragile, adored and betrayed, exalted and undone. Their palaces were cages of gold, their thrones precarious islands in the storm. Power gave them splendor, but never peace. Beneath every jeweled crown beat the same uncertain heart that beats in us all. Now the candles gutter out. Portraits fade into shadow. A forgotten diadem lies beneath dust, glimmering softly beneath the moon. It no longer signifies rule, only memory. For in the end, it is not empires that last, but the stories whispered after midnight, the voices that drift between dream and history. So close your eyes and let them rest, George, Catherine, Elizabeth, Marie, and all who once wore crowns of light and sorrow. Their reigns are over, but their echoes remain, floating through time like dust caught in candle glow. History does not vanish, it only sleeps. And tonight, as the world grows quiet, the kings and queens of the past settle into dreams once more, waiting for another voice, another night, to awaken them again.